By the time Rita Hayworth performed her famous striptease in Gilda in 1946, removing long black gloves while singing "Put the Blame on Mame," she'd become the embodiment of Hollywood sexuality. The scene made her immortal, a goddess in satin, confidence incarnate, every man's fantasy. But Rita knew the truth no one else could see. She was terrified every second, exhausted by performing desire she didn't feel, trapped inside an image that would define and destroy her. But the girl behind Gilda had never wanted to be watched that way. Margarita Cansino had spent her childhood performing in her father's dance act, feeling his controlling hands position her body, learning that her value came from male attention. She was shy, insecure, desperate to be taken seriously. Hollywood saw potential and erased her completely. Changed her hairline, dyed her hair, gave her a new name, taught her to move like sex incarnate. She became Rita Hayworth, love goddess, while Margarita disappeared so thoroughly even she couldn't find her way back. For 40 years she played the role audiences demanded, watching men fall in love with a woman who didn't exist. She said it best herself. They wake up with her, and they're disappointed. She spent her life being the wrong person in her own skin. Don't forget to subscribe to Lives Untold and like the video for your support. Thank you for subscribing. Margarita Cansino was born in 1918 in Brooklyn, New York, into a family where dancing wasn't art, but survival. Her father, Eduardo, was a Spanish dancer from a long line of performers. Her mother, Volga, a Ziegfeld girl who'd traded stages for motherhood. The Cansino household smelled of rosin and sweat, of costume fabric and rehearsal room wood floors. There was no childhood in the conventional sense, no dolls, no games, no privacy. There was only dance, and Eduardo's hands positioning her body before she understood what those hands meant. She started performing at 5, forced into adult routines with adult themes. By 12, she was dancing in her father's act at Tijuana nightclubs, places where men drank and watched and wanted. Eduardo billed them as the dancing Cansinos, father and daughter, but everyone knew what they were really watching. The acts were sensual, intimate, his hands on her waist, her body pressed against his in tangos that blurred every boundary a father should maintain. She learned to smile through the discomfort, to move as instructed, to exist as decoration for male pleasure. Eduardo taught her that her body belonged to whoever was watching, and the first person watching was always him. The clubs were dark and smoky, filled with men whose eyes followed her movements with hunger that frightened her. She was a child performing sexuality she couldn't comprehend, wearing costumes cut too low, moving in ways that made grown men lean forward. After performances, Eduardo would count the money and tell her they'd done well. She learned to measure her worth in dollar bills and applause, in the intensity of male attention. She was painfully shy off stage, awkward and uncertain, but on stage she became whoever Eduardo needed her to be. It was the first role, and it established the pattern. Margarita didn't matter, only the performance mattered. At 16, she caught the attention of Fox Studios' talent scouts, who saw her dancing at the Agua Caliente Casino. They offered a contract, small parts, standard terms, the usual Hollywood machinery. But more importantly, they offered escape from her father's grip. She was cast in minor roles as an exotic dancer, always in the background, always decorative. The studio liked her look, dark hair, olive skin, Spanish beauty, but couldn't figure out how to use her. She was too ethnic for leading roles in 1935 Hollywood, not white enough for the parts that mattered. She made a few forgettable films, and when her contract expired, Fox let her go without ceremony. But she'd tasted freedom from Eduardo, and she'd do anything to keep it. At 18, she married Edward Judson, a businessman 22 years her senior, who saw potential in ways Fox hadn't. He was calculating, controlling, but different from her father. He wanted to manage her career, not her body. Or so she thought. Judson understood Hollywood better than she did. He saw that her ethnic look was limiting her, that Margarita Cansino would never be a star. So he set about erasing her completely. The transformation was methodical and painful. They dyed her black hair auburn red, a striking shade that photographed beautifully. They raised her hairline through electrolysis, a process that involved inserting needles into each hair follicle and burning it away with electric current. Week after week, she sat in the electrologist's chair, while needles pierced her forehead, her temples, her hairline pushed back inch by agonizing inch to create a higher, more aristocratic look. The pain was excruciating. The scars were permanent. But pain was familiar, and Judson insisted it was necessary. They changed her name too. Margarita Cansino became Rita Hayworth, Rita from her first name, Hayworth from her mother's maiden name. It sounded American, sophisticated, nothing Spanish about it. They remade her publicity, her image, her entire identity. The shy girl from Brooklyn disappeared. In her place was Rita Hayworth, a name that meant nothing but sounded like stardom. She looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself. But then she'd never been taught that recognition mattered. She'd been taught to become whoever men needed her to be. Columbia Pictures signed her in 1937, and this time the machinery worked. With her new look and new name, she was cast in better roles, given more screen time. She was beautiful in the way Hollywood preferred. Red hair, pale skin, curves in the right places. She could dance, having been trained brutally but thoroughly by Eduardo. She photographed like a dream, the camera loving her angles, her smile, the way she moved. By 1940, she was appearing in A pictures, dancing with Fred Astaire, building a following. During World War II, her pin-up photographs decorated barracks and bomber cockpits across Europe and the Pacific. Soldiers carried her image into battle. Rita, in a black lace negligee, kneeling on a bed, hair tumbling over her shoulders, smile promising everything. She became the love goddess, the fantasy, the girl back home that every soldier dreamed about. But the woman in those photographs felt like an imposter. She was painfully insecure, convinced she couldn't act, terrified of dialogue, certain that any moment they'd realize she was just Eduardo's daughter playing dress-up. She relied on Judson for everything. He negotiated her contracts, managed her money, controlled her career. He was possessive and jealous, monitoring her movements, deciding who she could see. She'd escaped her father only to marry another man who treated her like property. But she didn't know how to be herself, had never been allowed to be herself. So she stayed, because being managed was familiar, and freedom was terrifying. Then came Gilda in 1946, and everything changed. The role was complex, a woman caught between two men, using sexuality as weapon and shield, performing confidence while hiding vulnerability. Rita understood that better than anyone. The famous striptease scene had her wearing a strapless black satin gown, peeling off long black gloves while singing "Put the Blame on Mame," the camera worshipping every movement. She wasn't actually undressing, just removing gloves, but the scene dripped with eroticism, with implied promise. It was suggestion, not revelation, which made it more powerful. The scene took dozens of takes because Rita was terrified, certain she was doing it wrong, but that nervousness translated as sultry tension. Director Charles Vidor understood he was watching vulnerability, pretending to be confidence, and that was more seductive than any actual sex could be. Gilda made Rita a superstar, the most desired woman in the world, but it also created a prison she'd never escape. Audiences didn't want her to be anyone else. They wanted Gilda, that knowing smile, that dangerous beauty, that promise of passion. Rita tried to explain years later. Men go to bed with Gilda but wake up with me, and they're disappointed. It was the most honest thing she ever said. She'd spent her life performing for men, becoming their fantasy, and now she was trapped inside the most successful fantasy she'd ever created. But Gilda wasn't real. Gilda was confident, sexually empowered, in control. Margarita was shy, uncertain, desperate to be seen as more than decoration. And Rita, the hybrid creation of Hollywood machinery, was lost somewhere between. She divorced Judson in 1942, and in 1943 married Orson Welles, the boy genius of Hollywood, the man behind Citizen Kane. She thought he'd see past the image, appreciate her mind. Orson was brilliant, fascinating, overwhelming. He talked about art and literature and film theory. He treated her like a muse, an inspiration. But he also treated her like a beautiful object to be admired and studied. He made her the lead in The Lady from Shanghai, cutting and dyeing her famous red hair platinum blonde, using her beauty for his artistic vision. She played a femme fatale in a film noir that confused audiences and failed commercially. Orson had experimented with her image, and Columbia's Harry Cohn was furious. She was Rita Hayworth, love goddess, and Welles had made her unrecognizable. The marriage collapsed under the weight of Orson's infidelities and ego. He loved her, perhaps, but he loved his genius more. She'd thought intellectual partnership would feel different than Eduardo's control or Judson's management, but it was just another version of the same pattern. Men who wanted to own her, shape her, use her for their purposes. They divorced in 1947, and she was back to being Columbia's property, back to being Gilda whether she wanted to be or not. In 1949, she met Prince Ali Khan, and the fairy tale seemed to begin. He was actual royalty, son of the Aga Khan, wealthy beyond measure, sophisticated and charming. He pursued her relentlessly while she was filming in Europe, and she fell hard. The wedding was international news. Hollywood glamour marrying Eastern royalty, the American dream meeting exotic luxury. She gave up her career, moved to Europe, thought she'd finally escaped Hollywood's machinery. She'd finally be valued for herself, not Gilda. But Ali Khan collected beautiful women the way other men collected art. He was charming but faithless, publicly humiliating her with affairs that made tabloid headlines. She was princess in name, but property in practice. The same pattern, gilded with wealth and titles, but identical underneath. She'd traded Hollywood's control for a prince's possession. In 1951, she fled back to America with their daughter Yasmin, the marriage in ruins, her mystique damaged by very public failure. Columbia welcomed her back because they needed her, but Hollywood had moved on slightly. She was 33, past her prime by industry standards. She made more films, Miss Sadie Thompson, Salome, Pal Joey, trying to prove she could still be Gilda. But something had shifted. The confidence had always been performance, but now even the performance felt exhausting. She married singer Dick Haymes in 1953, divorced him in 1955. She married producer James Hill in 1958, divorced him in 1961. 5 husbands in 24 years. Each marriage a search for something she couldn't name. Each divorce confirmation that what she sought didn't exist. Or maybe that what she sought, someone who'd love Margarita instead of Rita or Gilda, was impossible, because Margarita had been erased so thoroughly, even she couldn't find her anymore. By the 1960s, the roles dried up. Hollywood preferred younger women, fresh fantasies. Rita was in her 40s, still beautiful, but no longer the girl soldiers had carried into war. She took roles in smaller films, B-pictures, anything to keep working. She needed the money. Multiple divorces had left her finances complicated. But more than that, she needed the work. Without cameras, without performance, who was she? She'd been performing since age 5. Being watched was the only identity she'd ever known. But something was happening to her mind. Subtle at first, then increasingly obvious. She'd forget lines mid-scene, something she'd never struggled with before. She'd miss calls, forget appointments, show up to sets confused about what film they were shooting. Producers thought she was drinking, that success had made her difficult. Gossip columns called her unreliable, a has-been. But it was something darker and more devastating. Her memory was unraveling, her sense of time fragmenting. She was only in her 50s, too young for what doctors would eventually recognize as early-onset Alzheimer's disease. Through the 1970s, she deteriorated visibly. She'd forget where she was, who people were. She'd repeat herself, lose track of conversations mid-sentence. She became increasingly isolated, embarrassed by her confusion, withdrawing from the few friends who remained. Her daughter Yasmin, from the marriage to Ali Khan, became her caretaker, watching helplessly as her mother disappeared piece by piece. The woman who'd been Hollywood's love goddess, who'd driven men wild with desire, who'd defined cinematic beauty for a generation. That woman was vanishing from inside, memories dissolving like film exposed to light for too long. In 1980, doctors finally diagnosed Alzheimer's disease. Rita was 62. The diagnosis came almost as relief. At least now they understood what was happening. But understanding didn't slow it down. The disease progressed relentlessly, stripping away recent memories first, then older ones, working backward through her life. She'd forget her marriages, her films, her career. Eventually she'd forget even Rita Hayworth. Perhaps, in the cruelest irony, she'd finally become Margarita again, if only through complete erasure of everything that had come after. Yasmin made her mother's illness public, becoming one of the first advocates for Alzheimer's awareness. It was barely understood in 1980, barely researched, often confused with senility or dismissed as natural aging. Yasmin testified before Congress, established foundations, raised research money, fought to make the disease visible. She turned her mother's tragedy into a crusade, determined that Rita's name, the name Hollywood had given her, would mean something beyond sex appeal and beauty. It would become associated with a disease that needed attention, funding, understanding. If Rita's entire life had been performance for others, perhaps her final act could help people she'd never meet. Rita lived 7 more years, fading gradually, cared for by Yasmin and professional nurses. She forgot who Yasmin was, forgot her own name, forgot the films that had made her famous. The woman who'd spent her life being watched was finally, mercifully, unwatched. No cameras, no audiences, no expectations, just confusion and quiet, and the gradual dissolution of self. She died in 1987 at 68, from complications related to Alzheimer's. The obituaries celebrated Gilda, showed the famous glove-removing scene, remembered the love goddess. Yasmin remembered her mother, the shy woman who'd never wanted to be Gilda at all. What remains is complicated. The films endure, Gilda most of all, that black satin dress and knowing smile immortalized forever. New generations discover her beauty, her dancing, her screen presence. But what they're discovering is Rita Hayworth, the construction, not Margarita Cansino, the girl. They're falling in love with the performance, just like audiences always did. Just like the 5 husbands did. Just like the soldiers carrying her pin-up into battle did. But Yasmin's advocacy endured too. The Rita Hayworth Gala became one of the premier fundraisers for Alzheimer's research. Her name, that manufactured name that replaced Margarita Cansino, became synonymous with fighting a disease that steals identity. It's fitting, in the darkest possible way. Rita spent her life having her identity stolen by men, by studios, by the machinery of Hollywood. Alzheimer's stole it again, completely this time. But through Yasmin's work, that stolen identity helped others fight back against the same thief. Her famous quote haunts differently in retrospect. Men go to bed with Gilda, but wake up with me, and they're disappointed. She understood the tragedy of her own life with perfect clarity. She'd been forced to perform desire from childhood, trained to be decorative, remade into fantasy. Every man in her life, father, managers, husbands, directors, audiences, wanted the performance, not the person. They wanted Gilda's confidence or Rita's beauty. None of them wanted Margarita, the shy girl from Brooklyn who just wanted to be seen for who she actually was. The tragedy is that we still don't know who Margarita actually was. She was erased so early, so thoroughly, that maybe even she couldn't remember. The girl who danced in her father's arms before she understood why men watched. The teenager who let needles burn away her hairline because she'd been taught her body wasn't hers to protect. The woman who married 5 times seeking validation that performing couldn't provide. The star who played sex goddess while feeling like fraud. The mother who gave her daughter the one gift she'd never received, permission to be herself. Hollywood called her the love goddess, but she never felt loved. They made her the most desired woman in the world, but she never felt wanted for herself. She performed beauty and confidence and sexuality for 40 years, and it made her famous and lonely in equal measure. The role that defined her, Gilda, removing those black gloves, was 8 minutes of screen time in a career spanning decades, but 8 minutes of perfect performance trapped her forever. Perhaps the kindest interpretation is that Alzheimer's, despite its cruelty, freed her. It stripped away Rita Hayworth, the construction that had imprisoned Margarita Cansino. It removed the memories of performance, of exploitation, of being watched. In her final years, free from memory and expectation, maybe she finally got to exist without performing. Maybe she finally got to be herself, whoever that was, free from the male gaze that had defined her since childhood. We remember Gilda because Gilda was built to be memorable. But we should remember Margarita Cansino, the girl who had no choice, the woman who tried to find love in a life built on performance, the mother whose tragedy advanced science. Rita Hayworth was Hollywood's creation. Margarita deserved better. That we still don't know who she was, beneath all the manufactured beauty, is Hollywood's eternal shame and her permanent tragedy.